In this video, I get really, really cross. Because in this video, I'm dropping the poetry F-bomb. Can we stop with the foghorn, please? I'll say it one more time, for your ears only. F-O-R-M, form. Why is the word form a dirty word in some poetry circles? Is it really a dirty word in some poetry circles? Well, in this polemic, in this poetry rant, I'm going to talk about exactly that. So please do keep watching. So the first thing to say is I think we have to go back maybe 30 years or so. There was real antagonism between those poets that wrote formal verse and those poets that wrote free verse. And one of the great things about postmodernism is that as it continues to push the modernist envelope, asking questions about received forms, and in many respects doing a brilliant and startlingly refreshing look at received forms by reinventing them, reimagining them, and reframing them, postmodernism has managed to kind of bridge the gap, or at least disrupt that binary notion of us versus them, free verse versus formal, by allowing for received forms within postmodern poetry. Although I must say that allowance is only for modified versions of those progenitor forms. I mean, here are a couple of brilliant examples of contemporary poetry collections. American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassins, Terrence, long-listed, shortlisted in fact, for the 2018 T.S. Eliot Prize, and here in 2022, Anthony Joseph's winning collection of the T.S. Eliot Prize, Sonnets for Albert. Two quite brilliant books of poetry. And does it really matter that the sonnets in these collections of sonnets, that they are contemporary versions of the sonnet, that they're not adhering to some metrical structure or rhyme scheme from the way things were done hundreds of years ago? And the answer is no, it doesn't matter. They're just brilliant collections of poetry, brilliant sonnets. I think it raises a question, of course, about what is a sonnet, or what has a sonnet become, and we will also discuss that, I think, because over many hundreds of years, the form itself has changed, and these poets are, again, as I mentioned, reframing and reimagining what these received forms can do. But isn't that what Shakespeare was doing? Isn't that what Drayton and Sidney were doing when they took the Italian form, the Petrarchan sonnet, and then reimagined that for an English audience? ? So in the literary landscape, or more specifically the literary magazine scene today, you have free verse poetry, and then you have these kind of postmodern versions of received forms. That still begs the question, what about those received forms in their progenitor forms? They are conspicuous by their absence, their total absence, their total erasure. In fact, I challenge you, since this is a polemic, go out and find me a sonnet, find me a villanelle, one that adheres to the metrical structure and rhyme scheme of those original forms, the Petrarchan or the English/Shakespearean sonnet. You will not find one in a literary magazine today. Yes, there are a handful, maybe even less than a handful, of literary magazines whose aesthetic and approach is dedicated towards formal verse. There you may find a sonnet or villanelle in its original form, but you won't find it anywhere else in the literary magazine scene, despite the fact in their submission guidelines they quite clearly say, many magazines, please send us good poems. We don't care whether they are formal poems or free verse. The qualifier, the thing that will lead to publication, is the fact that they're excellent poems, regardless of that. And yet that is simply not true. You cannot find a poem that adheres to those received forms and those rules of meter and rhyme. Rhyme is also another dirty word. We'll come back to that as well with a quote by A.E. Stallings in a short while. But here's the thing. I've worked as a reader, not for a literary magazine, but several years ago I produced an international 10-minute play festival here in the city of Los Angeles. And for the last 2 years of that, we relocated to the public library. There's a 240-seat theatre, amphitheatre inside the library, wonderful space, and we used that. And with support from LA Made, I hasten to add, in our final year, which meant I could bring in 30 or so different artists. And we produced maybe 7 10-minute plays. We wanted an hour and 10 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes on the program, straight through without an intermission. And in the first year we were in that space, the submission window opened and we had 600 or so submissions. The following year we had 1,000 submissions. There were just 2 readers, me and one other person, and we read every single one of those plays. And I'm going to draw some parallels, really, between that experience and what I imagine it must be like sometimes for a literary, an editor of a literary magazine, a poetry editor, or a poetry reader, or part of the editorial team at a literary magazine. So the thing I found myself doing was, you are literally willing, you're willing the writing to be good, because after several very bad, short, 10-minute plays, you encounter a few that are, well, okay, or sort of mediocre, or kind of there, but they've got some missing ingredient. And then you strike gold. You find one of those absolute gems. And as you're reading, you're thinking, yes, is this going to be the one? And you keep reading, and it is the one. What an amazing thing to be a part of as part of an editorial team at a literary magazine, to find those gems and then to think about how they will fit in to the jigsaw that is the forthcoming edition of that literary magazine. And how exciting that the literary magazine gets to curate a bit of the literary landscape, and that speaks of and to and for emerging and established artists, and for the public that will read those poems in that magazine. A fantastic thing to do. So I can't bring myself to believe that a good editor is going to turn down a good poem just because it's a formal poem. Maybe I'm being a little naive here. I don't think so. I think that, excellent editors, they want to celebrate excellent work. It may be, however, because such is the volume of submissions within the submission window to a literary magazine, especially the really well-known ones, that lots of excellent poetry has to be left out of those magazines. Could it possibly be the case that, well, we've got several really very, very good poems here, and yet this one sticks out a little because aesthetically it's the odd one out because it is the formal poem? I don't know, but that's one possibility, I guess, with regards to why those poems would be left out. Another reason they might get left out is because, I guess, poets aren't submitting formal poems to literary magazines they know aren't going to publish those poems. So it's a kind of vicious cycle in a way, because the poets are thinking, well, and I've done this myself, I've actually sent formal poems to magazines I know specialize in formal poems and kept them out of the submissions I've made. So I'm guilty of that as a writer. So I think that's maybe also something that happens. But also I think about the way in which we learn and the way in which poetry is taught, not just to English literature students, but to students of creative writing. And in many respects, it makes sense that we teach poetry chronologically. So we go back to Old English, we work through Middle English, maybe the student encounters Anglo-Saxon alliterative forms of poetry, and then they move on to Chaucer and they encounter the iambic line, then they get to Shakespeare, and they keep going. In other words, received forms are something that you encounter on the road, on the journey towards the end point, which is, of course, where we are today in the sort of postmodern poetics, the world of postmodern poetics. Looking back, I suppose, modernism very, very nearby, and then further off in the distance, those early sort of progenitor forms I've mentioned, the iambic line, the villanelle, the terza rima, maybe by way of Dante, and the sonnet, of course. Now, if the creative writer, if the student poet is practicing those received forms on the way to free verse, then is it not reasonable to assume that some of their rougher poetry will be in those received forms as they're working out their who they are as a poet, what they want to say, how they want to say it, what themes they want to tackle? And so might we expect those earlier poems, those poems written in received forms, to be worse than their later free verse work? Again, I think that's an assumption that I make, but without really knowing. Another thing happens as well. I think it's a kind of form of poetic sprezzatura in some ways, because there have been occasions where I've read poems that are almost formal poems, but it feels to me that the poet's gone in and tinkered with things because they don't want to be seen as a poet who conforms to those rules regarding received forms. I had an experience recently like this. I was doing some different research and I was on a website dedicated to the haiku in English. Now, in English, of course, a pale imitation of the original form in Japanese. It may be that our syllabic count, because in English, the English language haiku is written according to the number of syllables per line. So line 1 has 5 syllables, line 2 has 7 syllables, and then the third and final line also has 5 syllables. And I've heard it said that perhaps that isn't enough brevity, that really, if we wanted to capture more of the feeling of the original in the original language, we would go for a shorter version of the English language haiku. So I was on a haiku website and I read about 300 English language haiku. I then went back, and some of them were very good, I have to tell you. I then went back, and as a totally random experiment that just came to me on the fly, I worked my way through those same haiku and counted the syllables on each of the lines. And of the 300 or so I read, not one of them, not one, conformed to the 5-7-5 structure that I mentioned earlier. So it may be true that brevity, or more brevity, is what's needed to make these poems successful. But I can't believe that not one of them would have been 5-7-5, and that the poet suddenly realized their error. Oh my God, I've written a poem that adheres to the structural requirements. I better just sort of subvert that in some way. And in fact, there were 1 or 2 poems I thought might have been helped by the addition of an extra syllable here and there. So I'm not sure. I just know that formal poetry is a thing. People still write formal poems, and yet they are conspicuous by their complete absence and erasure from the literary magazine scene. A.E. Stallings, current chair of poetry at Oxford University, very well established and highly regarded poet in her own right, said that the freedom to not rhyme must include the freedom to rhyme. Then poetry will be free. And I think the point she makes here is not just about rhyme, but it's about structure, metrical verse, and alliteration, and many other devices that are seen to be cliched or sort of unfashionable. How can a literary device be cliched? I understand how the poor execution or the poor use of that literary device can be cliched, but not the device itself, surely. But when I think about what A.E. Stallings says, I think about how we're in danger of reaching a point, if we've not already reached and surpassed this point, whereby the monolith that was formal verse is replaced by the monolith that is free verse. In other words, do whatever you want to do in terms of free verse. Write a prose poem, write your postmodern reinvention of the sonnet form. Do anything you like, but don't do that. Anything but that, which is a kind of rule. It's not just a kind of rule, it is a rule. It may be an unspoken one. And I mentioned the sort of self-censorship that I think some poets are susceptible to. But I think that we are in a place where formal verse doesn't have the chance that it needs. Because there's another very valuable point I think to be made here. As a poet, it's incumbent upon you to answer the demands of a poem, whatever that poem demands to be. And it's not always clear when you set out on that journey, oh, I'm writing a free verse poem. There are going to be 4 stanzas with 5 lines in each stanza. That's not always evident. It's sometimes, through the process of drafting and redrafting, you suddenly discover, oh, this is a sonnet. This needs to be a sonnet. And actually it needs to be a received form. It needs to be, for whatever reason, and the poem itself, the content should answer that for you. It's not always easy to get there, but you sometimes strike on just the right thing, the right sort of formal element that seems to answer the poem in a way, speak to it, and answer the problem that you may have been struggling, or the challenge you were struggling with about how to make that poem, ultimately how to make it work. And I've been stuck in this place as a writer myself on numerous occasions. So this is just some food for thought about the place of received forms in the contemporary poetry landscape. I would always advocate that free verse poets practice those old ways of doing things, of writing with, using the iambic line, writing metrically, writing that uses rhyme and sometimes in jammed so that the rhyme is softened. There are brilliant contemporary poets who do that. Seamus Heaney did that brilliantly. There's a wonderful poem by him called The Skylight. I think it's called The Skylight. Brilliant sonnet, contemporary version of a sonnet that actually adheres to the rhyme scheme of the original form. So I think what I'm saying is really this video is a bit of a prelude, I think, to a possible future video on the sonnet form. And I think if I do that, then the videos that follow may be in two distinct areas. First of all, looking at the Petrarchan form, and then the later English form that we sometimes refer to as the Shakespearean sonnet. So there you are. Poetry rant or poetry polemic has reached an end, a conclusion, or not exactly a conclusion. I think this is a debate that will continue, but I hope to have shared some useful insights and reflections with you on this binary notion of the poetry world. We know things are far more complex than that, but there has to be a place, if there is a place for this non-binary approach, there has to be room for three ways, and that is the received form, then the free verse form, and then of course the postmodern spin on all things from the past. Sometimes in this postmodern age, I think we're kind of trapped in the sort of jazzification of form. I think about the jazz musician. You ask them to play you a C major chord, just 3 notes, C, E, G. What you get back is the chord, but there's an added 9th and an added 13th there. You didn't ask for those things, but they were provided nonetheless. Sometimes you just want the C major chord, or perhaps some, I don't know, fancy, pretentious restaurant in the 1980s that serves deconstructed cheesecake. So a little crumbly pile of crumble over here on your plate, and then a mound of creamy stuff on this side of the plate, and you ask the waiter, what is this? I ordered cheesecake. Oh, it's the chef's deconstructed cheesecake. I mean, it's interesting, right? It is interesting, but sometimes you just want a slab of old-fashioned cheesecake. You can't find cheesecake in a literary magazine for love nor money. That's where I'm going to leave it. Thanks for watching. I'll be back very soon with more poetry content.